So for me, I would say it came at about 18 or 19,
Right.
when suddenly I realized that there were diminished expectations for me and that was deeply unfair because I was smarter than any guy I knew. Good evening, and thank you for going 2 by 2 into the Ark and sailing over to the 92nd Street Y to see my friend Debora Spar. Deb and I first met when I was chair of the board at Barnard, and we were searching for a new president. 2 wonderful students were on that search committee who sat on either side of me, and we would look at one candidate after another. Brilliant, brilliant women with amazing resumes. And over again, they would leave the room and one of the students would turn to me and say, boy, she was great. She was so interesting and she knew so much, but she wasn't Debora Spar. And that was how we eventually chose a president for Barnard. The only person that was Debora Spar was Debora Spar. As we got to know each other, however, it was very interesting for me to compare and contrast our views of growing up feminist or not, based on the fact that we're about 15 years difference in age. I think you can tell a lot about how quickly America changed during our lifetimes by the fact that my perception of how women should behave and what they should do and how hard they needed to fight was somewhat different from Deb's growing up. We'll be talking a lot about that, but I'd like to start with one element in the book, the quest for perfection, because I was particularly taken and saddened by a quote from one of our most illustrious young alums in the book, Courtney Martin. We are the daughters of feminists who said, you can be anything, and we heard, you have to be everything. What happened? Was it that with all those choices, we felt that we couldn't choose, that we had to choose all of the above?
You know, I think, let me just start with the sort of the generational point you made, because I think it's so important, and you and I have had many conversations about this. But I think after the 1950s, history, and particularly American history for women, moved really, really quickly. Mm-hmm. And so the year in which you were born as a woman really shaped your attitudes towards being a woman, being a feminist, really the whole way you thought about what your future was likely to hold. And I think I was born in 1963. And I think what happened for women of my generation was that we were really the very first generation that heard from the moment we were tiny that you can be everything, you can be whatever you want. You can do what we, your mothers, could not do. And I think that made us, on the one hand, an incredibly privileged generation because we grew up with these wonderful sets of dreams, but also in many ways a deeply conflicted generation because we were kind of the first generation that failed miserably because we could do everything. And ultimately, of course, we did it. And I think Courtney, who's a generation younger than I am, is reflecting the fact that sadly, this multiplication of expectations has only gotten worse. And so young women growing up today are getting this sort of wonderfully confounding set of messages. You know, you can be a neuroscientist, be good at STEM, play with trains like your brother, play with blocks, learn math, but wear a tutu and save the world before you're 17. And you know, we see them at Barnard, and they're wonderful girls, but they're exhausted by the time they show up at college because they've already been perfect for 17 years of their lives.
And we don't send those same messages to young men.
No, I think particularly not to white boys. You know, very rarely do you hear parents saying to a white boy, particularly a white boy who's born relatively affluent, you can be whatever you want, because that's sort of presumed.
Right.
So I think all too often, you know, for better or worse, when we're raising white boys, as long as they're not killing anybody, we're okay. But we don't put all these expectations on them.
You talk in this book so movingly about that quest for perfection, and I've talked about it a lot with young women. Has it always been there? Have women always pushed themselves? Is it just that the quest for perfection now includes perfection in the workplace as well as at home?
I think it's more that latter point. I mean, if you go back in time, I think women have always, like human beings in general, have pushed themselves to be successful. But traditionally, girls have only been pushed to be successful in a very narrow range of activities. I mean, for thousands and thousands of years, all that girls were really expected to do was to look pretty, get married, have babies, and cook dinner. Which, it's a lot to do, but it's manageable.
Right.
And I think what's happened now, and for all the best intentions, we've added to that, be a neuroscientist, or a Supreme Court justice, or write op-eds for the New York Times, but be pretty, get married, have babies, and cook dinner. And do all of them at that same level of perfection. So it's the adding together of these expectations that I think is causing us such stress.
Are you part of the first, you talked about being part of the first generation that grew up hearing you can do everything. Are you the part of the first generation that mistakenly thought all the problems were solved?
Totally. And I think, and again, I may have been particularly naive growing up, or particularly privileged or lucky, but I certainly did think, by the time I was a teenager, again, born in 1963, so by 1976, 78, Roe v. Wade was passed. So we thought, no reproductive rights issues. Thank you to your generation. We had the pill. We had abortions. The Ivy League, with the exception of Columbia, which was a little bit slow, was fully open.
Right.
So by the time I was applying to college, women could go anywhere. Graduate schools, quite frankly, were falling over themselves to admit women because they had sort of gotten the message that you have to have women. And so I really do think that women of my generation, again, if we were lucky enough to be born affluent and to be well educated, it really did look like we could do whatever we wanted. And it wasn't until we hit our 40s, I think, that reality sort of hit us over the head.
Is that when it was? Because I always feel when I look at the span of recent history that each successive generation hits the glass ceiling, has that click moment, as they coined it in Ms., at a different time. So for me, I would say it came at about 18 or 19, when suddenly I realized that there were diminished expectations for me and that was deeply unfair because I was smarter than any guy I knew. For you, when was the click moment? Can you think of one specific click moment where you thought, I was wrong about this?
Yes, totally. And I may not have been as smart as you, so the click came later, but it wasn't until my 40s. And I tell the story in the book. At that point, I had been, Harvard Graduate School. I was on the faculty of Harvard Business School, tenured at Harvard Business School. And then one day, one of my perfectly nice colleagues called me up and repeated the same phrase that by this time I had heard 1,000,000 times in my life, and every woman in this room has heard 1,000,000 times in her life. And he said, Deb, I really need you to, whatever it was, be on a panel, and I know it's not your topic, and I know you know nothing about it, but you'll be great. They'll love your energy. You'll do a good job. And then the voice went down, and he said, and we really need a woman. And all of a sudden, something clicked. And I said, you know what, Joe? No. And I said, I'm never again going to say yes when that phrase comes attached. And I realized, and again, I probably should have figured this out earlier, there was an awful lot of things in my life, for both good and bad, that were coming my way because somebody else needed a woman, and I was the only one left standing.
I must say that is how I was hired and then prospered at the New York Times, because they
needed a woman.
They needed a whole lot of women as a response to a class action suit. Don't laugh. Those 6 women made my life, those women who were brave enough to bring that suit. But then they fell into exactly what you're talking about now, which is not we need a whole lot of women, we need a woman.
And we'll ask her to do a whole lot of things.
Yeah, we need a woman, and I became the woman. And I remember how struck by it I was the day that an editor for a paper that took the New York Times news service was at an event, and I met him, and he said, Ms. Quindlen, we would love to run your column, but we already run Ellen Goodman.
Right.
And I had a feeling that Bill Sapphire never heard that about George Will.
And and that carries over. And I get this question all the time. Why are women so bitchy to each other? Well, first of all, it's probably not true. But secondly, if everybody knows that there's only going to be one woman, of course we're going to be fighting for that spot. And you don't get that with men because there's lots of seats around the table.
Have we gotten to 2?
We've gotten to 2. But, and as I say in the book, one of the things I found most scary and stunning is that the percentage of women in the top tier of every sector right now is between 15 and 20%.
Right, the
and
leadership
it's
lid.
tokenism.
Yeah.
It's essentially if a top committee, whatever it is, a board of directors, a management committee, they tend to have 2 people. I think there is now a mental checklist which says, oops, gotta have 2 women, 1 person of color. If I get a woman of color, it's a double whammy.
Right.
But if not, 2 women, 1 person of color, and then they think it's kind of done.
It's interesting to me that 15 or 20 years ago, which is when the leadership lid started, by the way, before then it was much lower, but it's never gotten much higher than that 15 to 20%. We managed to solve ourselves with the idea that it was because there weren't enough women in the pipeline. We always used a pipeline argument. There would be many more women editors, many more women partners, many more women surgeons, if only there were more women in the pipeline. Of course, today, we can't use that argument.
No, and that's where, again, the generational piece is so important, because that pipeline has been 50% women since my generation.
Right.
Because my generation, women went to the Ivy League and close to 50%. We went to medical school, 50%, law school, 45%, business school, a little bit less. So the pipeline's been full for 30 years. My generation should have had 50% of the leadership positions, and instead they've barely budged since since the pipeline started filling up.
Why?
Well, it's a complicated set of reasons, and that's really what I spend all the ink in the book trying to look at. I think part of it is that the workplace hasn't changed, and there's still, we know, deeply embedded prejudices and discrimination and all of those things. But I think the longer answer is much more complicated, and it's that women's lives still unfold in fundamentally different ways than men's. Women have these dual expectations on them. Women, we know, in the workplace tend to not put themselves up for promotion unless they think they're ready. Men don't care if they're ready. If somebody wants to promote them, they grab it. Women tend to pull back more.
The lean-in argument.
The part of the lean-in argument. Women have babies and men don't. And that's kind of a big deal. And I think, that's something that we underestimate at our peril, because where the differences in the data really show up is once people become parents. Statistically, men get promoted and get raises once they become fathers. Women no longer get promoted or get raises once they become mothers. Again, part of that may be embedded discrimination. Part of it is that when women become mothers, they tend to want to spend more time with their children. They tend to be the ones, more than 10, they take on the burden of childcare. They go to part-time, they reduce their hours, they go to flex time, and they start moving away from the power position. So it's more complicated than just discrimination.
Does the data show that that's changing with younger people?
It's not, sadly. There's no evidence yet in the data of any kind of shifts.
That's interesting, because when I look at my son who's 30 and his fiance who's also 30 and their friends, there seem to be a different set of expectations for how they're going to proceed, not just in terms of child rearing, but in general. I see what seems to be a younger generation that say, you people work 24/7, and I don't want to do that.
I see that anecdotally in my own kids, their friends, and in my students. We don't know yet because they haven't started to have children.
Right.
So we have to wait another 10 years to see if that actually plays out. And this is now the former economist in me speaking. What will be very interesting to see, and we may not be able to pull it apart, to some extent, their expectations are also being shifted by a much worse economy. So partly they've seen our generations and they're saying, I don't want that. But also, quite frankly, the jobs aren't there anymore. So it's becoming kind of hip to be a mushroom farmer in Brooklyn. But also that's because you lost your investment banking job. So, we can't quite tease that out.
In terms of anecdote, let me take you to another click moment. You went from being at Harvard Business School, which I think I could say fairly, is thought of as, in many ways, a stereotypical male institution to running a college that has educated only women for almost 125 years. Was there a moment when you felt like that little girl in The Exorcist where your head was spinning around on your neck?
I hate to tell you, I feel that moment sort of quite a lot. But I mean, I do half joke that I underwent a massive hormonal shift from going to a place that was loaded with testosterone to a place where you can't find it with the search party. And it's different. I mean, kind of everything is different, more profoundly than I would have thought. And I can truly say, I don't think one place is better or worse. I really, I don't think that a male place is better or worse than a female-dominated place, but gosh, are they different. They're different in ways that are, both profound and ridiculous. At Barnard, I'm convinced everybody knows every pair of shoes I have. At HBS, they were kind of aware of the length of my skirts, but that was it. The whatever we now call water cooler chatter is fundamentally different. As I say in the book, I have a whole drawer at Barnard of nice notes and chocolates that people send me. At Harvard, I kept batteries there, in that drawer. I mean, it's very, very different. And I think we, all of us, have to be more out front in outlining these differences, because if it is true, at least as I've experienced, that places run by women function differently than places run by men, then if we ever want women to succeed in workplaces that are dominated by men, we have to make those workplaces actually morph more towards the women-dominated workplaces, and we're not doing any of that right now.
Are some of the differences in a woman-centric institution differences that are essentially bad for women? For example, I'm struck by the ways in which we talk all the time at Barnard now, and did not when I was a student there, about how we're taking care of the students and how we will take care of your daughter and we will help her with this and we will advise her with that. And I keep thinking, this is too soft a landing.
Yeah, I think we may be too nurturing. Nurturing is good, but at some point there's too much cotton wool you can put around a 19-year-old, and you're not doing them any good. So I think that's an issue. I think there's positive elements. If I had to pick a negative element or a more complicated element, I found that women leaders and women managers and administrators tend to be less comfortable with explicit conflict. A male-dominated place, people are generally more comfortable saying, you're an idiot, you're wrong, I think you made a mistake. And it can be a moment of tension, but it's generally resolved, and then people are buddies again, or they're working together on the next day. I think a place dominated by women, there's more weight paid to whether or not you like each other. People want to be liked. People don't want to affect their personal relationships, and so they tend to bury conflict under the rug. It doesn't go away, though. It just stays buried. And I think that, in some ways, is a more difficult environment to manage.
Is there also a feeling that you have to build consensus, that you have to be communitarian? I mean, I remember one of the greatest challenges I had when I became an op-ed page columnist is that you're not in the business of being communitarian.
Right.
You're in the business of standing up on your hind legs and saying, I think I'm right about this, and let me tell you why. And I really felt that had I not been educated at a women's college, I wouldn't have been able to do that, because it taught me that my opinions were valuable in a way that wasn't true of some of my colleagues. On the other hand, having been very involved in many women-centric organizations, that push towards consensus at all costs sometimes seems to me to be, frankly, a waste of time.
It can definitely take up a lot of energy to get to consensus, but I think you're right, and a place like Barnard has this duality to it, that I think for the kids who are there, they come out, like you did, very confident. They've found their voices. They can go out and really compete in what remains a male-dominated world. I think it's more for those of us on the staff side who manage in ways that arguably devote a little bit more effort to consensus than might be ideal.
When they talk to you, the students, about their hopes and fears and challenges, what do they say?
You know, I have to say, I think our students are awesome, and like you, I'm very optimistic for this generation. And I think if I compare them to my generation, they're more realistic. Not that they're pessimistic, but again, my generation grew up thinking we could have everything. We had the rose-colored glasses on. This generation now, they're my daughter's age. They've already seen their mothers trying to juggle it all.
Right.
They know they can't have it all. And they are already quite strategic in trying to say, okay, I want to be Anna Quindlen, and I want kids. How am I going to figure this out? What's the best career path? And it was interesting, I was just giving a lecture 2 hours ago uptown, and a young woman, medical student, asked me, she said, I want to be a neurosurgeon, and people keep telling me I should have 3 children. I don't think I can be a neurosurgeon and have 3 children. And I confirmed her thought, and then an older woman jumped in and beat me up, saying you're killing her dreams. So, and I think I think this generation is looking for practical advice. They know they can't do it all, and they're trying to carve a more realistic path towards getting to whatever it is that matters most to them.
Yet I was struck by the fact that I was there 2 weeks ago for the Office of Career Development doing a session with students who were interested in journalism and publishing. And I talked a lot about the class action suit and about being a columnist and about writing novels and so on and so forth. And near the end, I said, by the way, I really want to stress the fact that I became an infinitely better writer and an infinitely better person by raising my children, by having 3 children and raising them. And they seemed a little bit taken aback by the fact that I would inject that into the conversation. Yeah. And I was quick to say that might not be the road for everybody, but I said, I don't want you to buy the hype that you can't do the things that I've done as a professional and do the things that I've done as a mother. It's just not true. Right. They seemed both taken aback and then cheered by that. Yeah. Do you think they still feel like they have to choose?
No, I don't think they have to choose. I think, and this is not very politically correct to say, I think it is very, very possible, and I say this to them all the time, to have a stellar career and a wonderful home life, including, more than 1 kid, but it's easier in some fields than other. Neurosurgery is hard. It's easier to do it as a judge than as a corporate lawyer, just because in one you're billing hours and one you're not. And I think those are the kind of practical things that they want to hear, because they do want to have careers and kids, but they understand, having watched their mothers, their friends' mothers, that it's more possible in some realms than in others.
You have this wonderful section in the book where you say, almost by definition, a woman cannot work a 60-hour week in a high-stress job and be the same kind of parent she would have been without the 60-hour-a-week job and all that stress. She cannot save the world and look forever like a 17-year-old model, or bake a perfect cheesecake the night before a major presentation. No man can do this. No human can do this. Yet women are repeatedly berating themselves for failing at this kind of balancing act, and quietly, invidiously, berating others when something inevitably slips. So what about the guys? Are we any closer to the moment where we say, well, I guess we've done some of the work? Because I don't want to say to my sons, oh, you should try to be perfect in every way, and you should make homemade cupcakes for the class trip, even though you have to hand in a major paper or teach a seminar. I want to say, not only should you not do that, I shouldn't do it, right, and your wife shouldn't do it.
Right.
Are we any closer to that kind of dialogue, or are the relationships between men and women so fraught, particularly at the micro, at the kitchen table level, that we do this to ourselves by refusing to say, you do more?
Well, I think it's at least two things that go together. I mean, the easy thing to do, or at least the easy thing to say we should do, is get rid of the cupcakes, right? And I use cupcakes all the time because it's a silly example, but every woman in this audience has been there. You know, you come home from work, you're exhausted, and you spend 3 hours making cupcakes because you want to make sure your kid has the right cupcakes for the bake sale.
You come home from work, you're exhausted, you're getting ready to take a shower and moisturize, and your kid comes in and goes, "Oh, I forgot to tell you.
Yeah, that's right.
We need cupcakes for
right.
tomorrow."
Right. And the sensible thing to do is to say, "Oh, too bad." Or go to the corner and buy ring dings.
Right.
We don't do that.
Right.
Or at least I didn't do that. And I think so. This is, again, the easy thing to do, but we don't do it often enough, which is to cut out the cupcakes. But I think particularly those of us who are working mothers, we feel like we've already done our kids a disservice. And you know, if they were too irresponsible to remember, it's because we were bad mothers for not making them more responsible from childhood. Right. Therefore, get out of the shower, forget about moisturizing, and bake cupcakes.
Exactly.
And we've all been there. And so that's a thing that I think, you know, women, quite frankly, we need to take on. We need to stop doing the cupcakes. And I'm not sure whether our kids' generation is necessarily going to do that. The second piece of it is, how do we bring men more into the equation? And there, you know, at least the data is pretty good. Men are doing more. We see more men, both anecdotally and demographically, you know, being active fathers, at least when in the cute baby stage, when they're, you know, in snugglies and being well-behaved babies. But, you know, I think there is more of an expectation that men will be active parents. What we haven't cracked yet is, again, taking the cupcakes out of the equation, and how do we, first of all, make the workplace more accepting of men taking time to be active parents. I think the workplace still is more accepting of the woman going home for the piano recital than the man going home for
Recent data shows that almost no one takes paternity leave, in large measure because they feel that it will be a black mark against them at work in a way that maternity leave would not be.
That's right. And the only countries that have managed to sort of fix this problem, as usual, the Scandinavian problem, the Scandinavian countries, where they make paternity leaves mandatory. So there's a workplace piece to this. But what's really interesting, there's been some great data out of Scandinavia that shows even with mandatory paternity leaves, men and women have differential careers after babies are born. Men do still get promoted more, women get promoted less. But what these researchers conclude is that the biggest difference between Scandinavia and the US is just the sheer number of hours we work. So you can have equitable parenting and equitable work-life balance if you're only working 40 hours a week. It's when both parents are working 60 or 70 hours a week, that's when the math becomes undoable.
But also, I'm going to return to the cupcakes, because part of the problem with equitable parenting is who cares more about stuff like this. So, for example, you're making the cupcakes and your husband says, "Why are you making the cupcakes?" And you say, "Well, he just told me that he needs cupcakes tomorrow morning." Well, that's his tough luck. Tell him he should have told you last week and you can't make the cupcakes. No, I have to make the cupcakes. You argue in this book that some of the weight we carry, some of the bricks in our personal backpack are crafted by women themselves.
And I think they are. And I think we need to fess up to that. And another click moment I had on the family side was one night when I came home from a full day of work, put my mom clothes on, ran around the house, made dinner, cleaned up, and I was running out the door to go to a PTA meeting. And my middle son, who must have been 7 at the time, said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to a PTA meeting at your school." He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, it's your school." He said, "Why?" I said, "It's your school." He said, "I don't care." And it was this brilliant sort of light bulb moment, because I thought I was going to the PTA meeting to be a good mother, but my kid could care less. And the PTA, let's be honest, really didn't need me. And there were other people who were really committed to the PTA, and that was a big thing for them. And it was one of those moments where I said, I need to take things off my internal list of what it means to be a good mother. And I think many of us, those lists in our head are just too long. And I think, and again, it's always my middle son who sort of drags me back to reality. I think we also need to acknowledge, as I do in that passage you read, that we are going to be different parents. You know, if we're working full-time, high-pressure job, we are going to miss some of those great moments. You know, we're making trade-offs.
And we're challenged to ask ourselves the key question, which is, what matters to the kids?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember a number of years ago sending my kids an email for a column I was writing for Newsweek saying, what do you remember for good and for ill most about your childhood? And my oldest sent me back an email and said, you went kind of crazy during the college process. And I said to the other two at the dining room table, I can't believe this. Quinn says I went kind of crazy during the college process. And they both went, you can't believe that? Oh my God, you were a lunatic.
Yeah.
And I think now, well, I want those hours back. And then at the end, Quinn said, what I remember most, having a good time. And I thought, you can put that on my tombstone right now. But we spend a lot of time going through the stations of the cross and not having a good time.
No, that's right.
I think it would be instructive for this audience to hear about another one of your light bulb moments, which you describe so well in the book, and that is the aftermath of the decision by the President of the United States several years ago to give the commencement speech at Barnard, and the response from some of our students' male student colleagues across the street.
Yeah, so this is the moment that I now refer to as the Baracus, for lack of a better word. But I can smile now. I was not smiling at the time. You will recall I was not smiling at the time. So we had this sort of, gift from the gods. The White House called us up and said the president would like to give the commencement address at your school. What do you say? Yes, thank you very much.
There is only one answer to that question.
And I remember, I think till the day my memory escapes me, that sitting in my office with the dean of the college, and we had very carefully crafted how the announcement would go out, and I was going to hit send, and it would go to this group and then this group, and we imagined the joy rolling in. And I said to her, something's going to go wrong, but I can't imagine what it's going to be. And we actually thought about it for a while, and she said, nah, nothing's going to go wrong. And if I had pushed harder to try to imagine what could have gone wrong, I never would have predicted what actually happened, which is we sent out these waves of emails, and because all action now happens online, there was ecstasy online for about a minute and a half. And then within a minute and a half, it got nasty. And on the various websites and blogs devoted to the Barnard and Columbia communities, all of a sudden, this nasty, it was overt jealousy. How can he go to Barnard and not Columbia?
It was overt sexism.
Well, it started as just jealousy. How can he go to Barnard and not Columbia? And then within another minute, the words, sluts came out, and Barnard women are sluts. Like, okay, what's the segue here? Obama coming to Barnard and Barnard women are sluts. I mean, there was no logical connection between these events. And then at some point, I literally had to stop reading because it got so pornographic, describing sexual acts on these. I mean, this had nothing whatsoever to do with the events about to unfold. And yet the level of misogyny and hatred was so virulent, it caught all of us off guard. Our students most deeply. And we kind of we were just reeling for a couple of days thinking about how to respond, and my initial response was just don't respond, don't validate this. But at some point it became clear that we had to respond. And it was a very, very painful moment. I think it was sadly a click moment for our students, because many of these young women had never dealt with misogyny before, and they took it personally. And it was really horrible for them.
But misogyny is personal.
Yeah.
I mean, to the extent that it
was directed at them.
It's directed at all women, and you're a woman. Does that mean that we still have a deep misogynistic strain in American society, or have we moved away from it?
I think sadly it's still there. And I'll just tell one small anecdote that has been enlightening for me. I don't know if it's true or not, but when some of this stuff was happening, I was talking to my older son, who had been a student at both Harvard and at NYU. And he said, and I kept saying, why are the Columbia men so horrible to the Barnard women? And he said, you have to understand, men at college are just horrible to women, period. He said that we had the same thing at Harvard, we had the same thing at NYU, but at Barnard and Columbia, there's just an obvious target for the misogyny to go towards, which shouldn't have made me feel better, but somehow it did. But I think that misogyny, sadly, is alive and well, and the internet gives it a home.
A home that it didn't have before.
It didn't have before, because people behave, thinking that they're speaking in a whisper or that they're anonymous, which they are. And now I've stopped doing this, but for a while after the Baracus, I started looking at other events, other women, and a friend pointed out to me that the same thing happened to Elizabeth Warren, of all people. So here she's out there, regardless of what you think of her views, doing interesting things politically, but if you read sort of the comments on anything she does, they become sexual within about 4 lines.
And a lot of them have to do with her appearance, too.
Yep.
Well, no wonder she's out being United States Senator. She's not very pretty.
Right.
And of course, then we all remember the spectacle in 2008 of the men who yelled at Hillary, "Iron my shirts."
Right.
As a way to say, you think you're going to do that, how dare you be out in the world. Did that event make more of your students feminist, or were plenty of them feminist to begin with?
I think that was an interesting, sort of scary year, because about a week after our event was when there was that horrible moment with the Georgetown student who was testifying in favor of coverage for contraceptives.
Right, Sandra Fluke.
Sandra Fluke, who got attacked by Rush Limbaugh. So another whole strand of misogyny. It was also the same year that we really started to see some states really pushing hard to restrict access to abortion and contraception. So I think we're actually, first time in my memory, I'm seeing younger women really going back towards, if you will, older style feminism, because they're seeing their rights potentially under attack in ways that they just hadn't imagined before.
I'm always very confused about why men don't see the upside of this. I mean, I gave Christopher Crowayton, our second son, a shirt from the Barnard Women's Center. It says on the front, "Dare to use the F word," and then on the back it says feminist. And he came home from college one day several years ago, and he was wearing the shirt, and I said, "Oh, Chris, you're wearing the shirt?" And he said, "Mom, I wear this shirt all the time." And I said, "You do? You wear that shirt all the time?" And he said, "Yeah, chicks dig it."
Chick magnet, yeah. That's right.
I mean, the truth is that my sons are attractive to women in large measure because they treat women in an egalitarian fashion. And I just feel like, recognizing women as equals
Should be a good thing to do.
Should be the thing to do.
Yeah. But I think, that T-shirt is an interesting T-shirt because, even on the Barnard campus, the students are very conflicted about the word feminist. Mm-hmm. And most young women, even most young women on what is clearly a feminist campus, will not quickly ally themselves with the word feminist. Mm-hmm. It has become a loaded word. And I think that's tough for sort of older generations to deal with, but the word has become loaded.
Well, but it's not the only word that's become loaded, and that's why I self-identify in every venue I can as a feminist, because there are certain words that the right wing decides to load. So now I'm supposed to call myself a progressive because the right wing has demonized the word liberal. Yeah. Well, I'm a liberal, and I also am an affirmative action hire at the New York Times. And if affirmative action means hiring the second best, then this is the second best. A Pulitzer or the bestseller list. I don't think we can let the other side take control of the words. And I think the other side took control of the word feminist, and that's why I'm going to throw it out there every chance I get.
And I think I 3/4 agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
Because
give me the other quarter.
I'll give you the other quarter. I think part of what the young women are responding to is the fact that the word has been loaded from the other side. But part of it, I think, is also the generational desire to define themselves differently than their parents. So I think, for women who were raised by feminist mothers, they don't necessarily want to be their mothers. They want to be something else. And so what I'm seeing is women rallying around girls' leadership, women's leadership, girl power, girls rule. It's the same argument with different words. And we had this, I don't know if you were in the room, we had this conversation at a Barnard event some time ago, and this debate was going on, and one woman finally stood up and she said, come on, ladies, how many of us in this room call ourselves suffragettes? Which I thought was a very good word, right?
That's an excellent.
You know, so where I come down is I'm willing to give up on the word. Let's further the cause, and I'm not going to worry so much about what label you put on it.
I'm going to ask you for a minute to be a futurist. When you were writing this book and thinking about the future, let me divide the question into two pieces. 25 years from now, where do you hope we'll be, and where do you think we'll be?
That's a really good question. It depends how optimistic I'm being. So I got into this fight with Anne-Marie Slaughter in an interview situation a while ago.
That's funny. I've gotten into fights with Anne-Marie.
It was a pleasant fight. But, you know, Anne-Marie is much more of an optimist than I am, or an idealist. You know, she would like to see a workplace that's truly egalitarian, where every place has on-site childcare, where every parent has access to high-quality, in-house, wonderful things all the time. I wish we would go there. I don't see any likelihood in this country that we're ever going to get anything close to government subsidized childcare, maternity leaves of more than the minimum that we have. You know, I wish we could look more like Denmark or Sweden, but we can't even pass a budget in this country. So the likelihood that we're going to get government policies to enforce a more egalitarian workplace, I don't see happening. So given that, what my hopes are taken down a notch. I would hope that we as a society would start to come up with different ways of structuring the work-family balance, for lack of a better word. I would hope we would adopt smaller houses as the norm, fewer cupcakes, less mowing of the lawns, less helicopter parenting, more egalitarian parenting, even if it's not quite 50-50. Mm-hmm. I would hope we would move from 2 women on every board of directors to 3.5. If we could get over the 35%, we'll get critical mass. I don't know that we'll ever see 50% of the investment bankers in this country be female. But if we could get to 35 to 40, I think we would see a qualitative shift.
Frankly, I think that's a reflection on what it means to be an investment banker and not a reflection on what it means to be female.
I think that's right. And I think investment banking would change in many ways if we did have more diversity, not just of women, but more diversity at the top.
But do you see that happening? Because one of the things I think that we did over the last 40 years is to redefine what it means to be female, to try to personalize what it means to be female. Do you see the opportunity to do that for men? Because I think the little boxes in which men find themselves are in many ways worse than the little boxes in which women find themselves.
I think we're going to start, I think that's the next great shift in the revolution. Mm-hmm. Because really the so-called sexual revolution has really only been about women thus far.
Right.
All the changes have occurred in women's lives. We are going to have to start seeing some parallel changes in men's lives. And I think one of the things that's going to push this is same-sex marriage and same-sex parenting. Because that's where I think we're really starting to see that same-sex households have really the same issues that heterosexual households have. You still have 2 people trying to raise a couple of kids and be in the workforce. And I think same-sex couples, to some extent, will set patterns of different kinds of sharing and different ways of organizing the household. And I think part of that will be starting to redefine what it means to be a dad.
That's so interesting. I've never heard anybody make that argument, that when you have 2 dads and one of them is the mom dad and one of them's the dad, that it illuminates some of the gender differences and non-differences.
This was really pointed out to me by a woman I know who is a lesbian investment banker. And she's married to another lesbian investment banker, and they were 2 happy lesbian investment bankers.
They're going to wind up on the cover of Time magazine at some point.
But they had 4 kids. And money was not an object, but very quickly they realized that time was a huge object. And they had to have a lesbian mommy and a lesbian daddy because somebody had to take over the primary child care. And I think this will, especially in a city like New York, where we do have large numbers of same-sex families, I think this is really what's going to force the change.
What about the perfection complex? Do you think women can find a way to free themselves from that?
Yeah, this part I think I'm actually more optimistic on because I think the pendulum is starting to push back. I think, if you just read the Times and, popular media, I think we're starting to see a generation of people becoming parents now who were themselves helicopter parented. And they're the ones saying, no, we really don't have to go to every hockey practice at 4 in the morning. And if we're going to hockey practice, maybe we don't have to go to ballet at 8 in the morning. I think that pendulum, I hope that pendulum is starting to move because it doesn't create perfect children, it creates exhausted children.
When you were working on this book, what that you discovered that you thought of that you could see coming or happening made you happiest? It relates to what you've said a couple of times. And I'm not sure I can predict this with much certainty, but I feel good when I'm in room, and I can't see who's in this room now, but when I'm in rooms like this and there are young men in the room, and they're the ones putting up their hands saying, well, I'm going to go work for JP Morgan, and I'm going to be in Dubai, but my girlfriend's going to be in Saudi Arabia, and we know we want to have kids within 3 years. How do we do it? And I can't give them answers, but the fact that the men are starting to think about this, I do think is indicative, and it sounds like you're seeing this with your own kids, that this generation is actually starting to think together and more realistic. What surprised you the most?
What surprised me, again, speaking like a recovering economist, is the consistency of the data. I knew the numbers of women in positions of power were small. I was shocked by how consistently small they are. So whether you call it the leadership lid or whatever, the percentage of women at the top of every single sector is stuck between 15 and 20%. The only exception is in technology and engineering, where it's 10% and going down. So the numbers of women in the tech sector are diminishing, and that terrifies me because I am enough of a futurist to say the future of this country lies at least in large part with the high-tech sector, and there are no women there.
That was one of the most surprising conversations I've ever had with a smart woman at lunch with Sheryl Sandberg, when I said to her, what's going to make a difference for women? And I expected her to say universal child care or legislation, and she said to me, more women need to learn to code.
Right.
I said, excuse me? And she said, more women need to learn to code. And in fact, I'm working with the president of Scripps right now to try to get more women into computer sciences, because the way for women to make more money is for us to figure out which jobs are going to pay more money in the future and make sure young women go into them. I had never thought of thinking of that way, and it's one of the reasons why Sheryl has been so smart and influential.
And interestingly, as Sheryl will tell you, she actually doesn't code.
Right.
But she was one of the very, very few women in anything like, her position of power who doesn't code. And she'll probably be the last one who doesn't code. And this is why, and we had a 4-hour meeting at Barnard yesterday to try to figure out how to get more of our women coding and into computer science. But the numbers across the country are going down. And one of the scariest things I've done on part of this book tour is I was at MIT 2 weeks ago. These women can code. It was the graduate women of MIT. These are brilliant women. They're getting PhDs in electrical engineering and computer science. And the stories they tell about job interviews they're going on are horrifying. It's the frat boy stories, and I can't even repeat them here. But the things they are being asked on job interviews have nothing to do with their coding skills.
That's astonishing. Yeah. MIT women?
MIT PhDs.
Well, that's one of the most depressing things that you've said all night. So I got an email interview the other day from a young woman at Barnard who was doing it for the Athena Center for Leadership. And it asked me a a number of questions that I've been asked before. And then at the end, she asked me a question that I've never been asked before that I thought was kind of genius, but I thought probably only one woman would ask another because it sort of threw me a little bit. And I'm going to ask it of you tonight.
Great.
Give yourself a compliment. Smart, right?
That's a good
I
question.
got to it and I emailed her and said, okay, this is one of the single most interesting things I've ever been
That's
asked.
a very good.
Because, of course, my first thought is, no. No, because I'm female. And then my second thought is, well, I can't compliment myself too much or too flagrantly or on something
It has to be self-deprecating in the
or
comment.
something like that. So give yourself a compliment.
I'm sitting on the same stage with Anna Quindlen.
Oh, come on. That is self-deprecating. All right, well, we have other questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask a couple of them. This is a good one. I'm a 31-year-old mother of an 8-year-old daughter. How do I raise her so she's not exhausted by 17, but she can still get into Barnard?
Okay, so I get called out on this all the time. Should I answer that one?
Yes, yes.
So the thing, I always have to be careful here because I say to parents, obviously don't go too far. Don't say to your daughter, okay, sit on the couch and eat bonbons for the next 14 years, it'll work out. That's
Right.
not going to work out.
Watch reruns of Sex in the City.
Yeah, and that'll do it. Although it does buy you a little bit at Barnard because Cynthia Nixon, of course, is an alum, so
Right.
that helps a little bit. I think, the colleges are not stupid. We can tell when kids are checking all the boxes. If your kid shows up and she's been the vice captain of 4 sports
Right.
and the treasurer of 3 clubs, we know she's checking the boxes. Let your kid figure out what she's good at. Invest, I don't mean invest financially, but if your kid really loves playing soccer, let her play soccer till her heart's desire. If she doesn't like soccer so much, leave her alone.
Right.
Let them find out what they're good at, what they like, and push them in that. But don't push them to do every single thing. The idea of well-rounded is overplayed. We don't really care if they're well-rounded.
One of the click moments of my life was when my oldest son was a junior in high school, and he was sitting at the dining room table. All of my kids, I don't know about yours, had a bad moment in junior year because they had all of the stress, but none of the ability to do anything about it until they got to be seniors. And Quinn suddenly said, okay, I know I was supposed to get into a really good high school so I could go to a really good college. And I know I'm supposed to go to a really good college to get a really good job. But after that, what's the point of the exercise? And I said, oh, honey, we just want you to be happy.
Yeah, that's such a lie.
And he slammed
happy
his
at
hand
Harvard,
down
yeah.
on the dining room table and said, Mom, there's a lot of things going on here, but happiness isn't one of them.
Yeah.
And I thought, Anna Quindlen, it is time to check yourself on this stuff. I mean, these kids just feel, I think, like they're under a lot of pressure.
And they are, particularly, in this city. They've already been applying to school since they've been 3 1/2.
Right.
It's a lot. It's a lot of pressure on a kid.
And you try, in retrospect, you want them to understand, which is why your third child benefits so richly from the
Yes.
experience of the first one, that some of this is not that important.
Right.
I mean, I hired people at the New York Times who had gone to very good colleges. Barnard students were astonished to discover that I didn't care if they'd been double majors, that in fact I didn't even look at their majors, and that I kind of thought people who put their majors on their resume were weenies, and I
weenies, yeah,
probably
exactly.
shouldn't
Right,
hire
right.
them anyhow.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there is that aspect of it. Why are the number of women in tech going down? Why is the number of women?
I think, I don't know scientifically. I think first of all, the way we teach computer science is not particularly helpful or useful for women. Maria Klawe, who's the president of Harvey Mudd, has done some fascinating work on changing how computer science is taught to make it more appealing to women, and it's not dumbing it down. It's making it more applied. Women want to learn, want to understand why they're doing these coding, what the algorithms mean. We have to change how we teach computer science. We also have to change the culture, the engineering frat boy culture that still permeates Silicon Valley. I think Wall Street, for better or worse, has cleaned up much of its act. Silicon Valley hasn't yet. And if, again, if the women who are graduating MIT are getting turned off from the tech jobs, what other women are going to take those jobs?
Well, and you illustrate an interesting conundrum, because I remember very well the telephone conversation that we had the day that you were asked to join the Goldman Sachs board. On the one hand, some of us tend to say, Wall Street, who needs it? On the other hand, if we turn down positions on boards of companies that don't have women, we therefore cannot get together and complain that those companies don't have women on their boards, which is one of many reasons why you, in fact, did join the Goldman Sachs board. And how many women are on that board?
2. We're working on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
With respect to women in the workplace, how much do you think things will change if and when policies around maternal and paternal leaves change for the better?
A little. I think we overemphasize maternity and even paternity leaves, because even, and I say this all the time, even if you get the most wonderful, let's imagine it's a 3-month, fully paid joint maternity paternity leave. What do you have at the end of it? You have a 3-month-old. Life is not easy. We have to come up with policies that allow for parents to have flexibility over the entire course of their parenting, which goes on and
Right.
on and on. They go away, they come back, and they're still there. So it's not just about infant care, because, and I'm sure everyone who's a parent in this room can testify, actually having infants in some ways is the easier part. It's the college applications, it's the first boyfriend-girlfriend breakup. And workplaces cannot be totally flexible.
Right.
They can't say every time your kid loses a tooth, you can go home. But we need to integrate parenting into the workplace, and it's much bigger than just maternity, paternity leaves.
And we also have to learn to accept and honor what people feel in their hearts. A 3-month maternity leave would never have been enough for me.
No.
I took a 6-month maternity leave with my first. I quit the New York Times with my second, and I took a 1-year maternity leave with my third one. And that wasn't because I couldn't get good childcare. It was because there was a lot of good stuff going on at home, and I wanted to be a part of that. And I think that's too little discussed. Having said that, I got a better job each time my water broke. The standing joke at the Times was if I'd had a 4th kid, I would have wound up managing editor. Unfortunately, there wasn't a 4th kid. Wait, I had another really good one here. Oh, I love this question. Well, I lost it, but to both of us, is there one thing you know for sure?
Yeah, I love my husband and my kids. Full stop. And my parents too, who are in the audience. I think I can't see them.
Yay. That's interesting, because when that Barnard student said, give yourself a compliment, I responded, I'm a really good mother and I have the kids to prove it.
That's good.
Does that mean that our role as mother is more important than our role as professionals?
I'm going to sound like an academic. I think it depends how you define important. On a day-to-day basis, I probably, particularly now as my kids are older, I spend much more time thinking about my career. I probably define myself more by my career. I don't define myself first as a mother. When people ask me what I do, I don't talk about my kids. Mm-hmm. But what goes on my tombstone? It probably going to be president of Barnard.
Having a good time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
What's next for you?
I have to figure out what my next book is.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, I'm in my postpartum book phase, which I always get depressed. But I know any book that I write too quickly is only a transitional book, and it's not meant to be. So I have to come up with the next book. That's my current obsession.
You near the end of this book, you say something that I think is so important for every young woman in this country to hear, and every young man too, and I want to end with this. Feminism was never supposed to be a 12-step program toward personal perfection. It was about freeing women from the narrowly prescribed expectations that society had traditionally thrust upon them, about giving them the power to shape not only their bodies and their reproductive lives, but their destinies and that of the world around them as well. So thank you for helping us think about that, for helping us do it, and for our Barnard girls.